The forest's vengeance. The logging crew had been working in the dense, untouched forest for weeks. The trees stood taller and older than any they had seen before, their ancient branches stretching high into the sky, their roots snaking deep into the earth. There was something different about this forest. Even before the first tree was felled, the men had noticed the heavy silence that lingered between the trunks, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. For the first few days the job went smoothly. Axes swung, chainsaws roared, and the massive trees groaned as they toppled. But then the strange events began. It started small. Tools would vanish overnight, only to reappear in the most unlikely places. A saw would be found deep in the woods, its blade rusted as though it had been abandoned for years, despite being brand new. Then machinery began to malfunction without explanation. Chainsaws that were perfectly fine one minute would sputter and die the next, and their trucks would refuse to start, even after being freshly fueled. The loggers blamed bad luck and the unforgiving environment. But at night, when they gathered around the campfire, they couldn't ignore the sounds. At first it was subtle, a rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, the faint echo of something moving just beyond the firelight. But soon the sounds grew louder. It was as though the entire forest was alive with movement, and yet every time they shined their flashlights into the darkness, nothing was there. "Maybe it's wolves," one of the men, Carter, suggested, poking at the fire. "Or coyotes. We're in the middle of nowhere after all." "That ain't no wolf," muttered Jackson, the crew's foreman, his face tense. "I've hunted wolves before. They don't move like that." The men exchanged uneasy glances. None of them wanted to admit it, but they all felt it, an unseen presence, watching them. The next morning they discovered the first real sign that something was wrong. A logging crane, one of their most critical pieces of machinery, had been completely dismantled. Bolts and gears were scattered across the forest floor, as though some unseen hand had taken it apart in the dead of night. "Who the hell did this?" Jackson barked, his eyes scanning the crew, but no one had an answer. Then, as they began their work that day, they saw them, the animals. At first it was just one or two, a deer standing on the ridge, staring silently at the loggers with unnerving intensity. Then a fox, its amber eyes tracking their movement. As the day wore on, more animals appeared, gathering at the edge of the clearing. Birds perched silently in the branches above. Squirrels and raccoons crouched among the roots, and even a massive black bear stood at a distance, watching. "They're not right," said one of the young loggers, his voice trembling. "It's like they're waiting." "Waiting for what?" Carter scoffed, but there was no humour in his voice. That night they barricaded themselves in their camp, but the eerie sounds grew louder. The wind carried the faint cry of wolves, but it wasn't just wolves. The howls were too coordinated, too precise. They were calling to one another, communicating in a way that felt unnatural. And underneath the howls was another sound, a deep, rhythmic hum, like the beating of a massive heart beneath the earth. In the early hours of the morning, one of the men, Lewis, was found missing. His tent was empty, his belongings scattered, but there were no signs of struggle. The only clue was a set of footprints leading deeper into the forest, far beyond the boundary of their worksite. Footprints, and the paw prints of wolves. "We need to leave," Jackson said the next morning, his voice low and grim. "This place isn't right. I don't care about the job anymore. Something's out there and it's not going to let us leave if we don't go now." But not everyone agreed. Carter, stubborn and prideful, insisted that they stay. "We've got a job to finish. We can't just run because some damn animals are acting weird. There's no such thing as a haunted forest." But even Carter's resolve faltered when later that day they found the heart of the forest. They had been clearing a path when the trees abruptly opened into a small clearing. In the centre stood an enormous tree, far larger and older than any of the others, its bark twisted and gnarled, its roots spreading out in all directions like veins. The air around the tree was thick, almost suffocating, and the ground beneath it was dark and wet, as though soaked with something far older than water. And gathered around the tree were the animals, hundreds of them, deer, foxes, bears, wolves, birds of every kind. They stood in perfect silence, their eyes fixed on the men. At the foot of the tree, lying motionless on the ground, was Lewis. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky, his face pale and expressionless. "We need to go," Jackson repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. But it was already too late. The animals began to move, slowly at first, then faster. The wolves circled, their eyes glowing in the dim light, and the birds swooped down from the trees, their cries deafening. The ground beneath the loggers' feet trembled, and the great tree seemed to pulse with life, its branches swaying without wind. The men fled, abandoning their tools, their machinery, and their dead. As they ran, they could hear the forest closing in behind them, the rustle of leaves, the snap of branches, the pounding of hooves and paws. They never returned to the forest. No one did. The logging company wrote it off as a disaster, a failed project in an uncharted wilderness. But the men knew the truth. The forest was alive, and it had protectors, animals far more intelligent, far more dangerous than any they had ever encountered. They were not just creatures of the woods. They were guardians, keeping watch over the heart of the forest, ensuring that no man would ever lay claim to it again. And somewhere, deep within the ancient trees, the forest breathed, alive and eternal, waiting for the next intruder. Thanks for listening to today's story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to Coffee House Whispers for more chilling tales. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Stay safe and beware of what lurks in the dark.